Thank you all for coming this evening. Just before we hand over to Griff, I'll just say that we'll be handing out vouchers to Interval, which is the union bar, which gives you money off beer, and we'll be going there for a drink afterwards if you want to join us for discussion. And then I'll just hand over to Griff for this evening.
Good evening, hello. My name is Griff. I was expecting a slightly larger introduction than that, but that's okay. That's all right. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm sort of a former actor, sort of thing. And people do make me say I arrived in Kendal a little while ago, and I got off the train, and there was the MP for Kendal had been on the same train as me, and he came over in a really exciting state. He had all his entourage with him, sort of, you know, officials behind him, because he could write. He was a junior minister in the last Labour government. And he came up to me and he said, I just want to say, what are you doing in Kendal? And I said, well, I'm the patron of the theatre here, the Bowness Laundry Theatre. He said, how fantastic, I love the theatre. It's great to have you here. And I said, oh, it's a pleasure. And he said, enjoy yourself in Kendal. And I just want to say, I'm a lumberjack and I'm all right. See, only this guy down here is laughing. Because I'm a lumberjack and I'm all right is a song that Michael Palin used to sing. And so everywhere I go, people rather respectfully call me Michael Palin, but I've nothing to do with Michael Palin. I just try to steal his job over the years. But what I am is president of, now for my sins, president of Civic Voice. And some of you may want to be interested to know what Civic Voice is, and I'll try and explain. It's a little bit of a complicated story to begin with. But way back in the late 50s, Duncan Sandys, who was a minister at the time, decided that it was important in the process of rebuilding Britain after the Second World War, because there was a lot of redevelopment that needed to happen, to try and get the population, the local population of the local population of Britain more involved in the business of redeveloping and redesigning and rebuilding their cities. And so he set up a series of civic societies under the banner of the name Civic Trust. And they operated, they were all across England, and there were about 300 of them set up, and at different times there have been previous civic societies set up, some before the war. I was in Cambridge a little while ago talking there. They've changed their name to Cambridge Past, Present and Future, because they found a little bit of difficulty calling themselves a civic society, because they were getting cut off, they felt, from some of their younger potential members. So they've renamed themselves. And I arrived, they told me that they just needed somebody, me in particular, because I'd been involved a long time ago, before most of you were born, in a programme called Restoration on the television. And before that, I'd been involved in quite a lot of personal work restoring and saving a place called the Hackney Empire in the East End of London. And so they thought I was a good fit for the job. I arrived, I asked them what they wanted me to do, and they told me that effectively I would have to do nothing. It was merely a figurehead position. I would put my name on the letterhead. They were effectively a form of government quango, almost. They were supported by various sort of enterprises that they ran. A purple award, which went out to places which had a successful and quiet night-time economy. And another one which was a green shield, I think, that went out to people who were particularly running open spaces well. They had a very large awards ceremony, and I went along to that, and I sort of supervised that for a night, and that went on till 3 in the morning. They gave so many awards away, one kind or another, to various architectural people. I remember being there and thinking it was a rather odd moment when one architect got up, and he was invited, because these were mainly awards to architects who had built pieces that the Civic Trust felt reflected or would help in some way in the regeneration or repositioning of an urban environment. And they were giving awards not only to bridges and buildings, but also to a thing like, if you know St Paul's Cathedral, there's a little kiosk opposite St Paul's Cathedral, which has been very beautifully designed with and they gave an award to that. So there was a lot of outreach to architects, and an architect who'd been on the judging panel was invited to give a little talk to the audience, or what remained of the audience, because quite a lot of them had decided by 3 in the morning that they weren't going to stick around. But he talked for about an hour about the history of modern architecture, and halfway through he came to conservation and he said, oh yes, and conservation, that's helped a bit with the tourist industry, I suppose, but let me move on to Richard Rogers. And effectively, as far as he was concerned, conservation had no part to play, really, in the history of British architecture. I can see what he means in a funny sort of way. He felt that the idea of conserving old buildings was something which politically, across the political spectrum, has been considered by a lot of politicians only to have virtue as a statistic, in as much as that it might help the tourist industry to a certain extent. The fact that it might have a spiritual or moral value for us as a people is not really something that's quantifiable within political circles. And one of the things that we might be discussing here, we might be asking ourselves a little bit, because we are facing quite severe planning changes that are coming into operation with this government at the moment, is the idea of value. Because a lot of the debate in planning is about value and the measurement of value to the community that you live in. However, what happened with I thought that was a bit weird. I thought it was a weird thing to say here at this award ceremony, because I knew that a large number of the members of these civic societies across Britain, I knew this already through visiting with you, they were concerned more about conservation, more about the preservation of some of the artefacts of their towns than they were about anything else. That was what they were members of this civic society for. So I felt that we were a little bit out of touch there, but the matter was brought to a head because about a month later the whole of the Civic Trust went bankrupt. I wasn't quite sure how it could go bankrupt. I didn't know that such institutions had the capacity to completely outspend themselves, but effectively they had rather a large staff, quite a lot of people up in Liverpool, a few people down in London. They'd overstretched themselves and they ran out of money, and so they were threatened with disappearing. And this is quite common for me. I was standing to one side as a titular figurehead, was asked then to come in and save the Civic Trust, and what had previously been a job which I'd assumed would just be me swanning in a suit from time to time and just sort of participating over awards, then became a sort of life or death struggle to save this institution, which is what we did. We took the opportunity, if you like, to slightly rebrand it and call it Civic Voice, and we took the opportunity to try and connect a bit more with the interests of the members. What I've been doing over the last 5 days is visiting Yorkshire. And you may not know it, but there are 48 civic societies across Yorkshire. They have membership of only about 7,000, so some of them are very small indeed. But my week has involved me in meeting, first of all, I went to Malton and I met with a group of guys who are trying to save the Milton rooms in Malton. So in a way, what we're talking about there is dealing with a very small community action. Something which is very positive and direct and simple. Here's a building, we like this building, it's an assembly rooms, can we save it? Over the years, because I've been involved in restoration, I've been involved in saving buildings myself, I'm aware that the principle of saving a building, or looking at a rather beautiful building as you walk down the road and going, that's a nice building, we ought to save that, is a time-consuming and expensive option. Expensive in as much as no building is going to restore itself. When we set off, I have some experience in this because I was invited to help with Acne Empire. Again, a completely titular role to begin with, but it took in the end about 10 years. And if you say that we've actually paid for it last year, and we started about 1994, you can see that actually the whole process has taken over 20 years. This is a lovely theatre. It's 2,500 seats big. It was occupied by a group of enthusiasts who were anarcho-syndicalists, most of them Trotskyites from the 70s. They had a little group of theatre activities that they were involved in, and one day they happened to wander into a place as they walked down Hackney High Street, which was an enormous, gorgeous theatre built by Frank Matcham, covered in cobwebs, about to be demolished, and they helped lead a little group of people who saved that building. They moved in, they started putting on shows. They were faced with the first and foremost principle of that sort of community action, is that you have to be able to follow it through. Don't start and get yourself involved in something as solid as that if you can't follow through. So they did. And their real principle was, how do you fill 2,000 seats in a theatre? We, as a society, don't assemble together as much as we did. It's one of the reasons why so many buildings are going begging. If you think of the buildings around you, that you whatever happened to that, why is that crumbling away? Who's going to save that building? It's quite likely to be a church, or a chapel, or a theatre. And I've just been in Bradford with the Bradford One company because they're trying to save a cinema. An inconceivable thing to me. When I was born, cinemas were huge business. Why on earth would anybody want to save a cinema? But like a lot of buildings, they were built, these are buildings that were built to fulfill an imaginative remit. They were chapels, often built by the community themselves, and therefore they wanted them to reflect something of their spiritual value, and often they got an architect in Portsmouth, and you find them to be some of the most magnificent buildings in the area you live in. Pubs. In London, we're losing pubs quite quickly. Really rather beautiful pubs, because in the 19th century, there's nearly always a connection with these things. In the 19th century, historical connection, the population of the East End were slum dwellers, and people lived 14 to a room. So the pubs, the breweries in particular, decided to build them rather magnificent gin palaces in order to attract them in and to give them a place to sit in the warm in the evening. And those places were lavishly decorated for the very reason that they wanted to provide people with a sort of paradise to go to, in contrast with the grim conditions that they lived in at home. But the same may be true of a cathedral. It was there built, and churches built there to reflect some notion of God, some aspiration in humankind, which was then built and left to the glory of the community in general. And that's one of the reasons why many of these buildings, when we pass them, we like them, they strike us as interesting, but it's also true that there are also buildings which are difficult to find further uses for. So the guys I was with in Hackney had started, Rhoda Muldoon, had started work on this building, and they started raising money, and they got me in, as it were, just to be a sort of celebrity face, to front the appeal that they needed to make to the lottery, who were a shoe-in, I was assured, because the lottery would give us money, because the lottery at the time, this was in the late 90s, were throwing money away, and they were just giving it to all sorts of buildings all over the place, but not to us, we discovered. For one reason or another, we failed with our lottery application. One of the reasons we were given two reasons. I think one of them was pretty cogent, which was that we were trying to apply for 21 million, a figure slightly plucked out of the air. In fact, 15 million would probably have been closer to it, but anybody who sat on committees of that kind, and there may be a few who here tonight who sat on committees, university committees, there's nothing like a committee for starting off with 5 million, and by the end of the evening ending up with 11 million, because somebody on the committee says, why don't we do this as well? And somebody else says, I've got a good idea. If you have to raise money, everybody would be interested to know that raising £1 million will take you roughly, well, I mean, let's say you raised £1,000 a day, every day, including Sunday, you'd have to do that for roughly 3 years in order to make £1 million. So if you set yourself a target of 21 million, you are actually asking at some point to join in the wider political world. No amount of jumble sales are going to save that building. What you have to do is effectively go out to the wider world, to the sources of funding, and start looking there. This is what I was called in to do. What got me going and made me into somebody who then became a bit of an activist and a pain in the arse for the lottery and for the Arts Council as well, was the idea that they had also said that one of the reasons that they didn't feel they could give the Hackney Empire the money was because they were worried about the matching funds not being available in Hackney. Because for every lottery, you're only allowed to gain about half of it from the lottery. I can't even remember the specific figures now, it all seems so long ago. You have to, unfortunately, get the rest from matching funds from sources such as charities or high net worth individuals, as they're called in the fundraising trade. And unfortunately, I got rather cross about that, because I thought, oh, I see, if we were a rich borough, as opposed to being one of the poorest boroughs in Europe, that would be okay then. If we were the Royal Opera House, then that would be all right, because the Royal Opera House can reach out to its very, very wealthy sponsors and donors, and they'll give us the money. And if we are the Royal Court, as another example, we'll be able to go to them. And there will be also, because we have national significance, there'll be plenty of people who help them. In the end, both the Royal Opera House and the Royal Court singularly failed to bring its sponsors on board. But because they were of national significance, of interest to the political parties, they effectively, at the point where they didn't find their money, were able to turn around and go to the government, cabinet ministers, and say, help us out here, will you, mate? So they did. Hackney wasn't, unfortunately, in much of that case, but mainly because by then we got a little bit aggressive. And they began to dislike us because we went to the Evening Standard on a regular basis and pointed out that, for one reason or another, we were too poor to qualify for their money. So with a lot of trying to shush me up and various other things, we sort of went ahead and we raised this money. But that was the reason, having been involved in that I found myself, as it were, at the forefront of restoration, and people sort of thought, oh, he sort of knows a little bit about this. So I got employed by the BBC with a programme called Restoration, which did similar things. What was interesting about doing the programme for restoration was finding out to a certain extent that there were lots of other people pursuing similar fantasies. Pursuing similar fantasies to the Bradford people who want to save the Odeon, or the Milton Room people in Malton, just round the corner from here, who want to save the Milton. Now, in a funny way, what they're doing is focusing very much on one aspect of community involvement. They're people with a fantasy, with a dream, and unbelievably, it is feasible to see that dream through. What we begin to learn through the Hackney Empire is that seeing that dream through is not necessarily something that can happen in isolation, partly for the reason that I talked about £1 million being an extremely large sum to try and raise casually. One needs to suddenly find oneself with a cause. Because whether I was in the business of trying to find high net worth individuals, fundraisers will tell you along the way that you can find people who want to give you £1 million. Hedge fund managers. In fact, every list that was ever made started with Andrew Lloyd Webber. In fact, and I had to sit with a fundraiser who we employed for a little bit and said, I noticed that you've got Andrew Lloyd Webber at the top, and he is quite famous. I see you've got Geoffrey Archer number 2. He's also quite famous. I imagine he must be on a lot of lists. I don't know whether we might persuade him to give us any money, but I notice you've got Mel Smith as number 3, and I can tell you for a start, he's not going to give you any money. Certainly not millions and millions. Mel Smith was my comedy partner at the time. So what we did pursue some odd people. I remember we went to Mohammed Al Fayed, and I had a contact in an advertising agency who told me that Mohammed Al Fayed had recently sold quite a lot of coal mines in Russia. And as a result, he had quite a lot of cash knocking around in an account. So I organised for Mohammed Al Fayed to turn up and visit the Hackney Empire. The Penta was on at the time, and we took him around. He arrived actually he made a fantastic arrival in there was a huge limousine drew up, and a lot of people jumped out of the limousine going like this and patting things like that and stood around. And then a white van rolled up about 5 minutes later, and Mohammed Al Fayed got out of the white van, and his bodyguard sort of did a lot of this around Hackney as he came in. We walked across the back of the stage, and the set for the Widow Twankey's washing place was up, and there was a big sort of cardboard flat with a stretcher across it. And as he walked past the stretcher around the back of it, Mohammed Al Fayed took hold of the thing and rattled it like that and said, "Yes, I can see you need help." And then, in all seriousness, without a sense of irony in it, we took him right to the top of the theatre. We looked out over the square in Mare Street. There was the town hall, and they were setting a rate that afternoon. So there were a lot of demonstrations taking place in the square. And he said, "What's going on here?" Roland, who was a 70s Trotskyite activist, explained that these were people protesting against the rate. Simon, who was with him, he was a strong old left-of-centre Labour supporter, and Mohammed leaned forward, looked out, and we thought for a moment he was going to address the crowd. But he didn't. He turned back in and he said, "You know why this is happening?" And we said, "No." And he said, "It's because Tony Blair is a homosexual." I turned to Roland, looked at him, and Roland went, "Yes, yes, yes." So there was a moment where I realised that in a way, whatever your previous predilections, the idea of trying to get hold of that money will change your attitudes. You will have to go through a lot of hoops. But bringing people in was not the whole story. The story involved also bringing in European funding. I felt a bit like one of those jugglers on the stage where I used to see when I was a child. I don't think they even exist anymore. Who used to put plates on bamboo. I'm glad you're here, sir. Everything I say, he nods away about everything. But we had to put plates. You had to put plates on these things, and they'd spin the plates. They get these plates up, and they effectively raising money for one of these events is going around and getting all the plates. Because as you go over here to start a plate going over here with the European Union, the one over here with the Western Foundation begins to run out of time. So you have to go over and keep that. And finally, you get all the plates running at once, and you think, we're in a go situation. It's quite a complicated procedure. But we knew that we would also now, when I started, so I said, I don't want to get involved in any of that politics stuff. I don't want to find ourselves, talking to politicians. I've also realised that these benefits we're doing, they really don't raise a lot of money. All these charity things we're doing, we'll try and concentrate and find some other way of doing this. And gradually, every single thing that I said we would never do, we ended up having to do. Because the process of taking things from the minor position within a community, something small like that you need large funding to achieve, means that you have to step out into the wider political world. We needed a cause. We had a cause. The Hackney Empire, in that particular case, was the community theatre of Hackney. I mean, we knew that this place, these guys, these enthusiasts, had to find a way of making that theatre work. So you would find on an average week at Hackney Empire, for example, there were Turkish singers on one night. Those Turkish singers brought with them the Turkish population of Dorset. We were one of the biggest ethnic theatres in Britain. We had farce, Blue Mountain farce, imported from Jamaica. And again, a fantastically popular event with the black community in Hackney. And we were finding that was a theatre which effectively was serving a value for the community, living in a theatre which was dying away through overuse, but a theatre which also was an important part of the spiritual centre of Hackney. And it's true to say, as I'm told, that when the riots broke out and people rampaged up and down Mare Street, a cry went up, "Not the Empire," which we felt was a rather wonderful conclusion to the sense of this theatre actually being a part of the community and fulfilling for people who lived in that area a real and solid use. So, in fact, I come from a background where I think that community action is actually rather a good thing. I think it's quite a cool thing to get involved. It's actually something which involves you in looking at your community together. It involves you in a consideration, if you like, of the political repercussions and the social repercussions of legislation. And it does mean, to a certain extent, that there's a payoff in the end, because you are affecting and being involved in a direct way in what tends to happen in your community itself. And so I was quite pleased to be involved when I was asked to come in and start work with Civic Voice, which effectively represents a lot of small societies who struggle and worry with the conditions or problems that they have with planning and similar problems relating to the urban environment. I'm very conscious that Civic Voice is a bit of an uphill struggle, because if you join the campaign for the preservation of rural England, you're immediately involved in something which does what it says on the tin. It's an inarguable proposition, and a quite simple one. Do you want rural England to continue? Do you see any value in rural England? Do you want to preserve it? No, fair enough. Okay, well, I'll join that society. I've certainly joined that society. I'm quite in favour of it. I think it's a rather useful thing, and it has fought quite a sustained and public campaign against this government's latest plans to build on the Green Belt. If you're a Green and you're involved in Green Party issues, then you also know that they have a pretty inarguable recruiting call, which is join us or we're all going to die. And I think that's also quite powerful message to send out to your potential adherents. It's a much more complicated message to talk about what it means, what the urban environment means. And yet it's actually come to a little bit of a crisis recently. One that I think probably not many people are really concerning themselves with at the moment, because I'm not sure that they quite understand what's going on. Planning itself, planning legislation, is a pretty boring issue. It's so complex that there are 1,400 pages of planning legislation at the moment. And this government has made a worthy statement that it intends to cut that to 52 pages. It's going to get rid of all that faff and those sillinesses, come down to a few straightforward principles which can be applied to planning. And that seems like a good thing. It's also said that it's introducing a localism bill, and that localism bill is encouraging people at grassroots level, ground force level, in the street, human beings, if they live in their houses, okay, they're encouraging them to involve themselves in local issues, planning, and it's inviting them to form neighbourhood forums which debate some of the problems that relate to planning in their area and what might happen. It's also introduced a bill for neighbourhood. It seemed at one point that they're replacing 1,400 pages of legislation with 1,400 separate bills in order to deal with this. But they've also introduced a thing called the Neighbourhood Planning Bill, which is intended to allow communities, in the absence of parish councils, to form themselves into new units which can then form a neighbourhood forum and then also talk to a certain extent about what's going on in their region. So there's some sort of things which seem to encourage the idea of local democracy and local involvement. What's interesting about both localism and neighbourhood planning as principles is that they have riders with them. And the riders are on the lines. In neighbourhood planning, for example, there are, I think, 5 categories that can go ahead as you can neighbourhood plan as long as what you neighbourhood plan fits in with European planning legislation, central government planning legislation, local district council legislation, and something else as well. But it does rather imply that there's not much left for you to plan if you have to make sure that you accord with the centralised conditions. But what does this centralised, what centralised planning are they intended to change? How are they going to do this 52 pages? This is an issue to a lot of people who are concerned at local level about what might happen. And I've been across Yorkshire over the last few days talking to people for whom this is a very, very powerful issue. In Addingham, a small village with 145 listed buildings in it, they've been told that they have to accept 25% of the size of Addingham in terms of increase in size and housing built on greenfield sites. Just down the road, another village has to increase by 50%. But the Wharfdale, which is a rather attractive series of villages running out of Leeds, linking Leeds and Bradford, is effectively told that it must now big up with the policy is to bring houses there and to make sure there are plenty of houses. You may say, as we all do, we need houses in Britain. We need to make sure that people are going to be housed properly, and these are some of the central tenets that centralised planning has to push or force on localities who are at the moment poised to say, not for us. You could see it as an important part of what's necessary for this country to make sure that we have provision for infrastructure, for power stations, for energy, for fuel, for roads, for trains, and to serve people we need more houses, millions more houses. These are essential things that as a country we need. You could also, in the light of most of the people who are talking to me, see it as a bit of a bully's chart. Because the issue is, if we're going to hurt, everybody has to take a bit of that hurt. So it's a bit like the bully coming up to you in the playground and saying, you are going to have to be hit. Where would you really want me to hit you? You decide. That's the point of the local plan. You decide where you're going to be hit. You're going to be hit in the face, the nose. Do you want to be hit in the gut? Which part? You don't have a choice about being hit. You are going to be hit. We're going to hit you now. That's certainly the way that some people living in Addington see the choice. But there's also slightly more subtle and complicated business here, which is going on behind the scenes. And the draft planning framework, which is not law yet, but has been passed into consideration so that people can look at this thing. The draft planning framework also includes a series of intentions and suppositions which centralised government is going to make. One of those is that if development is business orientated, then something must be done to ensure that it happens. You don't have much choice in that field. If a development is sustainable, in inverted commas, then that must also be given the go-ahead and must happen. There's no way that people are allowed, with their local plans, to turn down sustainable development. There's no definition of sustainable in that document, and sustainable is a pretty broad framework. It's sort of, we use the United Nations definition, it sort of refers to the idea that what you build today must also benefit the people of the future. In other words, we mustn't be too greedy or wasteful in what we do, and it must have some sense of the future. But it is a pretty vague concept. What is frightening the people of Wharfdale is the sense that there is plenty of land to be built in Bradford. There's plenty of brownfield land, recycled land, that could be used. Much of it is already owned by developers in the form of land banks. They own it, they're not developing it, they can't develop it. The government wants them to develop it. Not for the reasons that we might assume, I'm afraid, I'm being cynical about this, that the notion that they need more houses, but partly because they also stringently believe that the economy, which is at the moment in a bit of a nosedive, will get a lift up and take off again if we just allow for more building of any kind, the construction industry, to happen. And so there's an underlying emphasis in all this work, in all this legislation that's happening, which says we just need to see more building, full stop. And anybody who's standing in the way of that building is really causing us, as an economy and a country, a problem. And the difficulty in that is that they're also in league, to a certain extent, with developers who are saying, we can't build in Bradford or on brownfield sites because we won't be able to sell our houses. So they've introduced a sort of clause in local district planning which sort of implies that if it is uneconomic to develop on brownfield sites, then other sites have to be found, and what we're going to do is go out and build on greenfield sites. Now, I'm not saying that a village taking 25% more houses is the end of the world. I don't think that's the case. But if I look back on the history of see a considerable problem which relates to sprawl, to areas of emergency. To the 1930s, when planning legislation was only started to come in, when people started, in response to the previous economic depression, to build very wildly and extravagantly along ring roads and out along bypasses, and we introduced a complicated planning legislation to deal with it. It's grown to 1,400 pages, one may attest, because the actual principles of any planning or problem are not generalised. They are specific. They relate to the area and the needs and demands of one particular place or one particular condition. And to try and simplify those to the degree of working towards values, which are very straightforward and understandable, we must have development at all costs, leaves out some of the other values which we require in planning and building. In the draft statement, there was not one word about the quality of building. In the framework, the word quality has re-emerged. In the framework, it also starts talking about cities, and it talks about cities in town centres in quite specific detail. And it says, we need these places developed, and the emphasis must be on retail and business development. The community must be consulted, but first of all, the business community. Now, I'm not against business. I'm a businessman myself. Just a few statistics that might help. 87% of planning applications at the moment are already passed. They mostly passed, I think 93% of planning applications are considered and a judgment made on them within 26 weeks. That is not an economically crippling figure. And yet we're getting the impression from the Treasury, the government, in these planning regulations that are being released at the moment, that this process is entirely holding up our economic recovery. But whether or not that's the case, the real question for us as a community is, what values are we placing on economic development? And what are we really talking about when we talk about sustainability? For me, the consideration of the built environment we live in and careful and quality planning is actually about the future. I'm somebody who's interested in heritage to a large degree, but I'm also interested in modern architecture. My son is an architect. I have built in the past new buildings as well as restored old buildings. And so I'm certainly not somebody who sees himself as a sort of crumbly fossil who only wants to see 18th century standards return to Britain. I'm somebody who wants us to consider deeply what the future means. Because some of the values that are currently being presented to us, the values that people in Wharfdale are struggling with, the values to a certain extent that some of the people in Bradford are struggling with as well, they are values which are short-term and looking at the problem without really encompassing the changes that are happening in our society. It may be that our high streets are fading away. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you could give me a reason for that, because I think that that's got as much to do with the internet as it has with the lack of shops being built in high streets. It may be that we have shopping centres. Anybody who's been to Westfield knows that you go to Westfield and you experience a completely hermetically sealed, rather beautiful environment to go shopping. You don't go out into the wet, having left one shop, walk down a street covered with chewing gum, and make your way into the next shop. And so high streets are being forced to compete by this planning legislation with Westfield shopping centres on the basis that if we concentrate on retail, we will see the centres of our towns regrow and become some sort of rather valuable entity again. And yet, at the same time, there's no consider if we concentrate on development, business, and retail, there's no mention of the idea of people living in the centre of towns. Some of the most successful towns in Britain, or one of the most successful towns in Britain, is London. It's a successful town, not just because of its location, but because as a town, it's comprised of a series of villages. I would contest that those villages represent a future solution to some of the problems that cities have. Instead of a donut where everything is stuck in the middle with all the shops in one place and sort of a howling desert after about 8 o'clock at night, it's actually in London, if you walk down its major shopping centres, you realise that Oxford Street is 100 yards away from where people live. Kensington High Street, there are people living just off Kensington High Street, sometimes the richest people in Britain. In other words, there is no specific centre to London. London has already evolved into a place which is effectively saying, in a green way, I live here, I work here, I shop here, this contains me, and most of my needs are within this urban space which has evolved that way. Modern urban planners across the planet take that as a model for what they might see as the future. There's been some dispute, I know, amongst urban planners of what happens if you build for people so that they have their work and their shops and their living space together. They actually do tend to get in the car to go and look at the other one just a little bit further along. That's absolutely true, but it's avoiding what we see in the centre of Leeds, in the centre of Bradford, to a certain extent down here. The concept, which was very, very, very true in the 70s, that the best solution to any town was to drive motorways into the middle of it, which allowed cars to have access to it. In Leeds, a great deal of southern Leeds is developed as buildings in the middle of car parks, places which effectively human beings don't want to walk around and don't want to live in. I don't call that sustainable. I call that a vision of now and the motor car, and not a vision of the future, the far future. Because for me, the future is also about what we leave for our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. If we sprawl, if the idea that's coming from the government at the moment is we haven't allowed ourselves to sprawl for 50 years, let's sprawl some more, let's go out into the green belt. And it's no good saying we're not really going to go into the green belt. You only have to go to Wharfdale to find out how much of the green belt is under target. And it's under target because of that support for the idea that the developers must be given their choices about where they go. And also they're going to provide homes in Wharfdale, which is by far from being affordable homes. The houses that they're going to build there build into the middle class sense of this is the houses that we need. Instead of taking our cities and saying, how can we recycle our cities? How can we reuse our cities? Shops today, retail, which anyway is a difficult concept to deal with, and maybe we may be seeing in the next 50 years a complete change in the nature of retail. We are also looking across Sheffield now at a vision of an inner city where retail may be leaving and going away, but we need to know that these shopping centres, as they're built, can have a further use. Do they have a further use? We're taking cities of one kind or another, particularly still in smaller towns like Ipswich, we're slightly destroying, we're destroying our medieval street patterns in order to allow bigger shops to come. Because at the moment, the fight to the death in the retail world is that Sainsbury's wants to be Boots, Boots wants to be W.H. Smith, they all want to sell clothes and hair gear and food. They all want to be all things, well, they want to be sort of massive department stores. This is being achieved across Britain by taking quite succinct and neat human towns and driving into it huge shops, massive shops, which require massive supplies from big lorries, massive goods entrances that you walk past at a bit of a pace so that you don't find yourself for too long by those shitty waste paper bins and all the rest that hangs around it. So we have to ask ourselves, are they really looking at the future there? build fake medieval closes on the outside of town in the form of little sort of cul-de-sacs of cookie-cutter houses with no sense of place out there, and destroying the places which have the continuity of some form of human activity in them in the centre of our towns. And I find that wherever I go. That in fact, for me, what excites me about heritage is nothing to do really with the sense of, oh, it's an old building, old worldly, or even the sort of architectural iconographic sense of building. So we say, we list all our buildings, we go round and we say, we like that building, we care for that. For me, it's the character of a city that really counts. And it's our front room. Effectively, cities, these are the places with which we invest our spiritual awareness. It's the places where we put our cathedrals, it's the places where we put our cultural centres, like museums and theatres. And there is nary a mention of that in current planning either. The idea of the city centre being anything but a business, commerce, or a retail opportunity is completely missing. We are never, unfortunately, or with great difficulty, going to notice that in 100 years, if we lose some of our retail opportunities, we're never really going to be able to go back to those shopping centres and say, oh yeah, great, let's turn these back into houses. In Cardigan, in Wales, they face a declining high street. They applied for a heritage lottery, sum of money, and that cost them, I think they were given about 3 million. The heritage lottery gave them 3 million to look at the whole of this high street, which is essentially 18th century high street, take down all the plastic signage, remove the bad windows, stick up some proper lime wash paint, and repair the general look of the vernacular housing that went, or vernacular shops that went along that street. And it was a tremendous success. Instead of spending 30 million to build a shopping centre in Cardigan, what effectively they did was turn the high street itself into a destination. And we might look at that as being romantic twaddle. Because why would, I mean, what difference does it make what the place looks like? What is the spiritual attraction of going to a shopping centre which has actually been cleared up a bit and made into something? Well, who knows? I can't define it, but I know that people started to go there. They were interested enough to make their way to Cardigan, to shop there. They were interested enough to open new shops in an area which had previously been declining. And that's simply a question of saying, let's look at this place and turn the high street into something of a destination in itself. The centres of towns across Britain, we might ask ourselves, how do we do that instead of focusing on the cheapest option for keeping this place, or the most business-like development option for keeping it? So all I'm saying is I believe that the principle of good planning enshrines more values than development and commerce, and needs to take account of some of the visions of the future that might be slightly different from the slightly short-term effects that planning is beginning to put into current planning legislation. Now, civic societies across Britain, for one reason or another, are slightly worried about what's happening with this planning legislation. Each town, as we know, has slightly different problems and wants to a certain extent, to try and open themselves to doing what they can to take this foot in the door and push it open a little bit further and see if they can be involved. I went to Cambridge to talk there, and Rumbers wrote on the comment page in the local newspaper, "Where do you live, Griff? As I've got some views on development of my own, and I'd love to come and tell you and your neighbours what I think they should be doing in your community. Does anyone actually care about your opinions except for a few pompous, NIMBY fossils?" One of the problems we face, seriously, is we just don't have enough young members. We do have a lot of NIMBY fossils involved in this business. We actually have not many young people who care or realise that actually there is anything to be gained from being involved in this process. We're looking at what happens in their community, not just as a community level of the way people live, but the actual look and feel of where people live. to experts, to academics, to planners, and to centralised government attempting to make sense. During the 70s, a lot of towns across Britain sent councillors on trips to America to go and look at Los Angeles. And they came back full of a vision of the new world that they could create if only they were given enough roads to do it. And as a result, they have introduced quite a lot of motorways that run right to the middle of town. Anybody familiar with London might be interested to know that the Tottenham Court Road was originally going to be a 6-lane motorway running straight down to Centre Point. And you can see as you walk down the Tottenham Court Road, the bits of it were, when they got planning permission, were made to push back from the pavement, leave more gap. It wasn't to allow more open space. It was to allow effectively a 6-lane highway to charge right down there. There were huge plans for running motorways all over London and for tidying up what planners saw as a terrible, disorganised Victorian muddle. It was stopped basically because that's where the politicians lived and it's where the lawyers lived. There was a plan to take Edinburgh and put a 6-lane motorway straight down Prince's Gardens. Do you know Prince's Gardens? Straight down the middle. 7 people got up, lawyers, activists, a couple of local MPs, and worked the system to make sure that it didn't happen in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh didn't have a 6-lane motorway running into the middle of it. You may say, if you've ever been to Edinburgh, that would have been a useful thing because you've been able to get into it quite quickly. The difference is, it would have effectively ruined Edinburgh. The truth is, I went to meet the guy, one of the civil engineers, who took the motorways into Glasgow. And you can travel across Glasgow, anybody who knows Glasgow, quite well at 70 miles an hour in any direction you like. They knocked down quite a lot of tenements and quite a lot of quite important architecture in order to build them. And I asked him how it was, what was the thought behind it? He said, well, there was a chief of the engineering, of the road engineers in Glasgow, in the region, and there were just 7 of us. And the 7 of us together designed this network. He was very proud of it. It's a fantastic engineering achievement. Whether it's done an enormous amount for Glasgow, I don't know. What I'm interested in is the fact that it is possible for small groups of people to have a strong effect on what is proposed. I'm nervous of legislation that makes that more and more difficult to do by putting values into our system which are new values enshrined as development of business interests and retail interests and leaving out some of the other values. And I personally am on a recruiting drive. That's why I've come around Yorkshire, because I know that politicians don't think there are much votes in the idea of preserving or maintaining the status quo in cities or small towns across Britain. I went a long time ago on a radio show, we were discussing restoration, and all the other people around the table on the start of the week started talking about the programme. They were generally flattering about it. We came to Anne Willikin and she said, no, I think this is a terrible idea. My constituents are not the slightest bit interested in seeing old buildings repaired. They want to see them driven out of the way. They get nothing but interference from the planning regulations. I get hundreds of letters a week from people complaining about busybodies interfering with what they want to do to their house. And you suddenly saw the world from a Member of Parliament's point of view, which was effectively, there are all these letters in green ink arriving every day. She goes down to the surgery. There's a great queue of people saying, I've just been forbidden to change the windows in my front door by the planning commission. When are we going to do something about it? Well, they're doing something about it now. Quite a big way. Because most of the people who say, like the way things are, or like buildings, or like the central market towns to be middle class, cosy, quaint, they don't speak up, or they don't speak up in a way which is effective for a Member of Parliament. So, yes, that's what I do. I'm hoping that it might be possible to get young people to join civic societies or get involved in something cool like trying to help a theatre or taking community action for all sorts of reasons. And it'd be interesting now to see whether people have any thoughts on that side of things themselves.
attempt has failed. The building is up for auction now. But it has been said that it will be put to some kind of common use. But it will not be a theatre or the plans that they had for it. It was just too big a task, really. Heroic efforts were made, but that's just one that's fallen by the wayside.
Well, individual buildings of assembly, as I say, they attract people, they become a big issue, and sometimes, as you may know, the population of Bradford were brought out en masse to hug the Odeon, and they formed a great line around it to say, stop buildings. And that's an appeal, that's an emotional appeal to that great cinema. It's much more of a problem, though, to find the real commitment to see it through and find a job for it, because it's a big building. But we're overlooked here. I was over in Park Hill yesterday, and we were walking around there. And Urban Splash are a company of developers who take on projects of extraordinary difficulty for one reason or another, because they think those buildings are good, because they like them, and because they're the sort of people who walk into an area of Manchester which is completely run down and falling to pieces, deserted, with houses boarded up, and say, we can do something here. And thank God there are. And in other words, they don't see the necessity to turn to greenbelt land or green fields to make their money. They actually are concerned with the idea of what can they do with the actual existing fabric, keeping some of the existing fabric, restoring the existing fabric, recycling the existing fabric, and getting it working again. And what's really interesting is that Park Hill is a groovy building. I mean, it's a really interesting place. When you go up there, you get a fantastic view of Sheffield. You actually get in that building something which is really not a hideous building at all. A building that effectively was designed for one purpose. That purpose became complicated. It's also a building which actually reflects in a strange way the values of the 60s. And those values have also proved to be complicated in architecture, because in a way it's a piece of moral architecture. I was brought up some of the time in Harlow Newtown in Essex. That's an interesting piece of moral architecture as well, because that was town planning which was built and designed to be an overflow from the London slums, a new town, but it wasn't a place in which human aspiration was worthy. Because the problem there was you made a place where if you got rich, you moved away from Harlow. So effectively, you created, with the best intentions, a ghetto, a place which, to a certain extent, causes problems for the people who live there, because they feel all the time that they've been exiled to a town which was designed, and there are towns in Scotland which have been similarly designed and have similarly become blighted. So now what's happening in Park Hill is a considerable amount of private enterprise going into that. I've actually said to them, well, you ought to actually take the top flats and make them into the most massive penthouses. Because if you make them into the most massive penthouses, 3 or 4 rock stars moved in there, then everybody else would move in there as well. Then you wouldn't have any trouble with it. What?
Phenomenal views.
Yeah, phenomenal views and cool buildings. And a fantastic location. I mean, the whole setting of it could be, and will be, I'm sure, a rather cool place. So in other words, what I'm interested in, and this is, there are values that go into all planning decisions. And we have to be careful that we don't assume that the only worthwhile values are values which make us feel right. If you see what I mean. I think that the planning regulations and planning procedures need to reflect the fact that we live in a multifaceted world, and that even though I've spoken hotly about developers' business this morning, I was talking to the corporate members of Leeds Civic Society, including a lot of lawyers, quite a number of architects, and a number of developers and builders, including the guy who had made the latest, I can't remember his name, in Leeds, the big shopping centre that's just opened. And he was very concerned that we should be open to the idea of his shopping centre, and we were, we discussed it. My point is that forward thinking into the world we live in has got to somehow take account of the changes that are happening in our society. Now, not the changes that were forecast to happen 20 years ago, because effectively those changes are not actually happening now as nearly as much. I mean, we're basing this on predictions that were made and are already out of date, a lot of these changes. We need to actually work to involve some of the different aspirations and values of humanity, because those things are not always rational. As Rhys, who is a writer on this, a Dutch writer on this, he said, you know, you look at why people are connecting to their towns. I mean, I have to be really careful. I was once writing an article about the Stour, a beautiful river, and I said, you don't have to linger long in Harwich, you can set off up the river and it's beautiful. That was front page news in the Harwich Advertiser. You don't have to linger long in Harwich, says TV comedian. You know, they were going to hang me up from lampposts. The MP was called in, the mayor came out, you know, and Harwich is a lovely place. It was just, I'm not trying to slight Harwich, I like Harwich. You know, people are attached to Harwich. I mean, if you live in a shithole, you love that shithole, I guess. But the truth, no, Harwich isn't a shithole. I mean, if you lived in another place, which was, you know, so the truth is that in a funny way, this commitment to our towns, to the idea of the place we live, is something which runs deep and actually ought to be satisfied in planning regulation. It's a very difficult thing. In other words, they're not. One of the problems is this mismatch between the people on the ground, their feelings about things, and the things they like, and the difficulty of centralising authority and instructions to the world to get on. It's one of the great complications of actually living in an overcrowded city. And that's why I think the issue of what is effectively an extremely complicated series of documents, and quite a complicated, difficult area, boring area to be involved in, which is planning, because planning applications can go on forever and ever. In Hadley, in Essex, Tesco arrived, and Tesco were going to build themselves a huge store in this tiny market town between the town itself, rather beautiful sort of medieval town, really wall town, and the river on the water, which the town is. Now the town in 1983, he said they didn't want it, and they fought continuously ever since then to try and stop Tesco going. They've done everything they possibly can. They found it an extraordinary struggle, because Tesco had an enormous weight of financial power behind them to employ lawyers and experts and people. And you think, we can't buy Tesco. I mean, this is like being involved in a sort of Napoleonic struggle. Why? Why are Tesco? So, I mean, the people have said, the parish council, the people of Hadley have said that they don't want it. There was a point when some people in Hadley were a little bit sort of, you know, we think a Tesco might be quite nice. So the antis got the traffic increase as measured by the expert, and they got in their cars and they drove around. They got lots of people to drive their cars around the town and up and down the high street to exactly measure the increase, to replicate the increase in traffic that the expert had predicted. And then they had 98% anti in the town. The whole town said, we just cannot have this happen, that this quiet town is now going to be a sort of turn into this traffic monstrosity. And they fought. If you go on Tescopoly, which I really recommend, it's a very amusing site, and it's across the country with people fighting fights against the great Satan, Tesco. And they fight it all over the place about what Tesco. And Tesco wrote me a letter saying that, you know, you should understand this is national policy we're following here, and district council policy. You go, okay, well, I don't mind you following national policy, but one size does not fit all. 2 days later, they offered me a very lucrative advertisement as well, which I had to turn down. Unbribable. But it was a most curious thing. It's fine. And you realise that within this structure, Tesco had got a lot of experts. And to the horror of just the ordinary parish council, people who were working on the other side, Jonathan Glancy, the Guardian's architectural correspondent, lives near Hadley. He became a complete not in my backyard person, and joined in with this. And they, to their horror, they discovered that within the whole judicial inquiry sort of process, you are not allowed to question expert witnesses. or expert, you're allowed to question them, you're not allowed to question their evidence because they're experts. And so they found all the time things like the design, which they objected to, they weren't allowed to object to the design because an expert had decided that design was okay. You go, oh, right, I didn't realise there was an expert who told me what I should aesthetically feel about things that are being built. Well, that's apparently the case in judicial reviews. But what they did find is, rather cleverly, they found out things that Tesco had left out of their application. They got lawyers to sit down and tick every box and go through everything. The things they'd left it out, the inquiries, they would go, you've left this out, that's a negative point, Tesco, and so on. And they, by working that way through, like, it took them months to do this. What they also did was they wrote to the expert witnesses and asked them to clarify various things they'd written in the application. And the various people employed by Tesco wrote such balderdash in return, if you see what I mean. They wrote these letters back which deliberately designed to obfuscate. They then they got their QC to get the experts to read out the letters that they'd written. And this infuriated the judge. Infuriated. It didn't infuriate the idea of reading them out, but as they read them out, he was astounded by the lengths that these experts had gone to obfuscate and try and pretend that what was obvious was not obvious, and he castigated them. They lost. June, completely they lost Tesco, and they were told, that's it, that's the end. And in August, they simply reset and started all over again and put their application back in again. And now the people of Hadley, who have said no to Tesco, now have to start their fight all over again.
Yeah, we had that happen in an area called Park Head in the southwest, and we then got a petition of 3,000 people, and that was the end of Tesco forever at that site. So it might take more than one try.
Well, Hadley are in a bit of despair because they've done everything they possibly could. But go to Tesco, it's quite interesting. But you see, you may be all saying life is too short for this sort of stuff, Griff. I will wait until I'm an INBI fossil myself before I get involved in all this stuff. And you may be right. The interesting thing is, though, that it's not difficult to decide what's good and what's bad. What really got me going about this holiday, what got me going really, was the fact that I had worked to save this theatre. We did in the end. It's a long struggle. The builders went bankrupt in the process of making it, so we had to take it back and work with the whole thing. But finally we got it finished. I think sometime in the next 3 or 4 months we'll get a positive result and have all the money we need, because even though the builders went bankrupt, we were left with huge amounts of money to pay. The insurers refused to pay out, as on the understanding that we would not be able to find the money to fight them. I mean, they knew that we filled in the policies, right? But they just reckoned if they kept appealing, we would gradually run out of funds and they'd never have to pay the money to actually. So luckily, Sir Alan Sugar stepped forward, gave us the money, and he's a bit of an anarchist, and he helped us, and so we have got that money, and we have fought Aviva, and eventually I think we're going to win our case and get that money back. But one of the things that interested me was that if you walk around the East End of London, the same planning regulations actually apply across the East End as apply in Belgrave. They're not really very different, but you wouldn't know that, because the region of Hackney suffers from dereliction. It suffers from areas which have not been developed and hoardings have gone up. It suffers from shabby building put up because nobody can be bothered to oppose the buildings that's put up. That it suffers from the loss of useful sections or good sections of the streets. And now, of course, the middle classes are arriving in Hackney and with their sharp elbows beginning to concern themselves about these issues. And concern is part of what it means to be part of a community. But if you're poor and you're working hard, it's time consuming. And perhaps only old, retired people like me can actually find the time to get involved in these things and see the struggle that happens. Does anybody have any thought? Yes. Sorry, but yeah, can I go to somebody at the back? Yeah.
How do you think the conservation planning system in England could be improved to help with the mediation between development and conservation?
I think 2 very simple things need to happen. For what it's worth, but I'm no expert, but I'll say it, but these are my opinions. The first is that you should not free yourself of the need to pay rents if you demolish the building that's standing on the site. So what happens is, one of the reasons when you go to Leeds, you see these empty car parks in South Leeds, or you probably see a few in Sheffield as well, is because if you have a building there, you pay rents. If you knock it down and you clear the site, you don't pay rents. So what could be a bigger encouragement to demolition than that? You can let it get a bit run down. Somebody says to you, you ought to preserve that building, and you go, I'm afraid it's beyond hope now, and so you knock it down. But of course, your incentive to knock it down is pretty strong. The second thing is, if you repair that building, you will pay VAT on it. If you start by building from scratch, you won't pay VAT on it. That's 15 to 20% extra cost, and it's going to be more expensive to repair an old building anyway. Even though in simple green terms, recycling an old building is a far less carbon emitting process than starting. Concrete is one of the biggest. The making of concrete is one of the biggest carbon emission problems in the world. Sorry, anybody else? Yes.
What do you think of the word asbestos, and how does it apply to, or not apply to, restoration, development, past, future, modern asbestos?
Well, I've struggled with asbestos myself. And asbestos is a very complicated thing, especially, funny enough, if you're in rural Wales. When we took down the roof of the little shed, it was made of asbestos. Asbestos is now, I don't know what they call it, a registered poison threat, because inhaling asbestos is extremely dangerous. And that means that you have to dispose of it at huge expense. Well, particularly if you're in rural Wales, because the nearest dump for the asbestos was near Bristol. So we had to take down the asbestos, cover it up carefully under huge success. And what I mean by success is I mean a commercial success. People want to be there. They want to be in those buildings. There are some buildings, and I don't point any fingers, in Leeds which are not a commercial success, because they were built on the principle of raising everything out and making the biggest building that you can possibly make on the site, with the largest number of flats, and a lot of those remain unsold as a result. Because this is what I mean. We're in the business of creating human value in areas. That's what cities are about. They're about trying to decide what we want out of us, what makes us feel good when we are there. And that's what urban planners, to a certain large extent, concentrate on these days. Any other questions? Sorry. Yep.
Say, and where do you think they will go in the future?
I don't know. Now this is interesting, because we were being asked quite a lot about brutalist architecture today, because the Yorkshire Post building, which is not high-rise, but it is brutalist architecture. And you go, okay, a couple of guys I know have gone to a lot of trouble to buy into a couple of Erno Goldfinger's flats on the top of high-rise buildings in Tower Hamlets, because they love them so much. They love those buildings. Trellick Tower, and we used to see as you go along the Westway in London, you look over to the right, there's this fantastic tower which was hated with a great vehemence by people like my ilk sometime in the 70s. They had a violent antipathy to this concrete tower. In other words, I don't believe the towers themselves are mistakes. I think that there was a moral value involved often in creating these towers, because the two sets of people who lived in those towers, who've been forced to live in towers, are the very rich and the very poor. The very rich in New York, for example, live in towers. They don't have any trouble about it. They like living in towers. And today, they're building huge towers all along the Thames, which are sold as flats to rich people, and they live there. But if you're going to build a city in the sky, then there's an element that must go with it, which is the ground floor needs to be patrolled, controlled, and actually looked after properly. And you need to create a city in the sky which is not composed of just people on the edge of society. Not on the edge of the poorest, but alongside the poorest, the homeless, and possibly people who are drug addicts and whatever. Because under those circumstances, the city in the sky becomes a ghetto. and for that reason becomes a difficult place for people to coexist. And so you're engaged in a form of using building as social experiment. And to me, we ought to be careful about seeing building as a social experiment. We also ought to ask ourselves, with experimental architecture, did the experiment work? In science, I don't know if there are any scientists here, if we go and do an experiment and it doesn't work, we don't do it again. Or we modify the experiment to make the thing that does work. There's a terrible tendency with architecture to treat the experiment itself as the final result. And architecture, which is experimental, will often need to be reconsidered and refiddled with to make the experiment work. They've done that in the Brunswick Centre, in the middle of Bloomsbury. That was a bit of an eyesore, failing, and structurally it was failing as well. It had been badly built of concrete and not properly finished, and it was beginning to fall apart. It was an experiment that needed rebooting. And they did, and now it's a hugely successful building. So the same is happening in Manchester with the Piccadilly Centre, where they built, at one point they thought it would be great to have people walking on high levels above the top. It was a great 60s thing, partly because a lot of 60s architecture is actually influenced by Mediterranean architecture. The idea that we actually spend a lot of time swanning about in the sun, whereas we don't. It rains, it can be pretty gruesome in parts of Britain. And for that reason, great sort of platforms in the sky exposed to the sun don't necessarily work. But the architect who's working on the Piccadilly Centre now is looking at that from the point of view of saying, if we remove these steps, if we remove this upper level, we can bring this building back into the framework of the city. And he's putting new values into that experiment. So personally, I think that we do move on, change our attitudes to buildings, the way we can use them. And I would be against, for the same reason, knocking down the Yorkshire Post building. Does anybody know the Yorkshire Post building here? Anybody in favour of the Yorkshire Post building? I rather like it. It's an interesting building. And in a way, finding a new use for it is an imaginative challenge that can actually, by putting two ideas together, can result in a third idea, which is really exciting. Yes, sorry.
The English Heritage has had cuts made to its grants. So what do you think could be done to bridge the economic viability gap of regenerating conserved buildings?
Well, English Heritage has had, one of the questions that's complicated for English Heritage is that English Heritage looks after a series of buildings that nobody else wants, ruins, and it only tends to, English Heritage tends to end up looking after the building because that building has fallen through various sieves. I mean, in other words, it's an important building, but it's not a building that can have anything done to it because it's Grade 1 listed, can't be changed to something else. It's been decided that it's a monument of significance, and as a monument of significance, it's often in a place which is rather curiously inaccessible. So it does have these buildings to deal with, and it's still trying to find a way of doing it. Where it comes under more attack is the sense that what also English Heritage is doing more and more is siding on the side of moving forward instead of with planning, instead of stopping things happening. It doesn't want to be a preventer to progress. So what happens is if the British Museum wants to develop a building and knock a hole in the side of the Edinburgh 7th building at the back, English Heritage says, yeah, okay, go ahead. And then the Bloomsbury Association and various other people say, what are you doing, English Heritage, allowing that to happen? And what happens is the Victorian Society, the Bloomsbury Association, English Heritage spend about 2 years fighting each other over this, and the British Museum goes ahead and knocks a hole in the wall. So one of the problems for English Heritage is not just financial, but where it's going to stand, because it represents a policy, but to some what we would call the more radical fringe of conservationists, it seems to be following, because it's a government department, too much of the government's line. I wouldn't care to comment on that. I'm not sure. It depends, for me, on the case. But I think it is a complicated business, like all state-owned things, as to who it's serving when it does that.
I'm an architect, studying to be one.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in restoring buildings. Like, we ran a project in the Wicker, which is an area in the north.
Yeah.
took old buildings and we sort of had the idea of transplanting structure inside of it. We came across, well, when we took this to reviews, and we took it to Singapore as well, but we were asked, it's happened a lot in Hackney, in Hoxton, Shoreditch, you change these buildings, make them usable again, but then you gentrify them at the same time.
Yes.
And so I suppose what I'm asking is that how do we get those buildings to the people who need them, affordable housing? How is that? How do we get that?
Well, I agree. It's a problem because, in a funny way, the problem of affordable housing is causing a considerable sort of logjam across the country. Section 106, which used to be forced on developers, basically allowed a local council to say you can have this building in return for paying gates, affordable housing or helping with school. And they're now introducing a sort of general levy of money on work. The problem with the general levy is the money could be taken away by the council to pay for things which are nothing to do with the locality where the building is being made. So there's a worry that this general levy will result in just a simple way of taking money off the developers and being used for things at a complete distance which the council needs to pay for and having nothing to do with the area. So I'm not sure that the latest solution is genuinely a solution. But the problem that's happened in parts of the East End is that Section 106 has been so stringently applied by some councils that nothing has been built at all. Because the developers say, we can't afford to do it under these circumstances. What you're demanding is so extreme in terms of the affordable homes that if we try and match that we won't build. And Hackney has had the finger pointed at it recently in the House of Commons as being the particular authority that does that. Town Hamlets is another. But the complication with the idea of whether these things effectively get to the people themselves, I think improvements to a district, I'm a believer in a funny way in improvement and preservation and the idea of whatever we call it, tidying up a region is a way forward. And we may talk about gentrification, but we're involved in a strange way for the last 50 years. The British race has been involved in the process of gentrification. Most people now, when they're asked, call themselves middle class. And so, in a funny sort of way, the sort of definition of a sort of class war in architecture strikes me as a post-war thing, and actually slightly worried for that reason. I think it's slightly retrograde often to think of development in those terms. I know that flats in London, for example, houses in London, were built speculatively, many of them, to try and capture the upper end of the market. And there are places in Kilburn where you go off main Kilburn Highway and you come across great large houses. Now when those houses come up for sale today, people go and their surveyors come along and say, show me when these were made into flats, because we need to know that for the purposes of our lease. The further back you can't find out. Because in fact what happened is the speculative builder built originally as houses for the gentry. The gentry never went there, and within 3 months they were turned into flats and sold on as affordable housing. What's weird about our financial arrangements today is that many developers make promises to banks about how much they're going to sell their houses for. What you really want to see is some of the housing that's being built, which was aimed at the expensive end of the market and didn't sell, starting to fall. We haven't really seen much of that because people are hanging on there in the hope that banks are supporting some of these developers, in the hope that those buildings will become in the hope that they'll become the recession, the rich will come back and buy into those houses anyway. I think there's another different thing which you're probably interested in as well, is there a sort of cut-off point for ordinary people in terms of what an architect does? do ordinary people, working class people, really want to live in an architect-designed house? And yet I believe that's also a cultural change that's happening. When I was involved in a programme to make a film on knocking down the famous building in Portsmouth, and now I really apologise because I can't remember its name, but in the 60s, it had a terrific award-winning building. And it had become derelict and an eyesore, and we went out to do vox pops amongst the people. And I went and interviewed them. And my director said, nobody cares about it. You're not going to find people in the street who know about this and really care about it. And I said, well, let's see. And we went out, and it was basically true that everybody over 40 hated the building. But everybody under 30 loved it. They thought it was a really cool building. Really interesting piece of architecture. And yet, it was completely demolished. And I think it's partly the same with, I can't make a complete judgment on this, but I think that younger people probably think of Park Hill as being a rather cool building, rather well designed and interesting building, and older people would see it as being a little bit too modern and frightening. So I think this is also a generation thing. I mean, I think this is an education thing and a trickle-down effect, and difficult to make straightforward moral judgments on. I think it's part of what we are as human beings. And those fashions change. I know that architecture, especially as it's taught, doesn't like to mention the fact that it's actually a fashion. It wants a more rigorous belief. It wants architects to believe that they're involved in a sort of moral crusade of some kind, and they're actually involved in they're actually involved in a great sort of in a great calling and profession, which is actually far from reflecting the needs or wants of fashion. But actually, I think more architecture is actually about fashion than we care to think. Or certainly the academics. Yeah. So that styles change and alter, and one of the great post-war fallacies has been that the architect is involved in a sort of great moral battle for the saving of humankind. And some big mistakes have been made on that basis, I think. Anything else? Well, that's just my opinion. And that's just because my son's not.
What do you think there's a role for sort of ex-industrial and factories in heritage and placemaking?
Very much so, because what was great about the discovery of the industrial unit and the using of ex-industrial units is that they always were the earliest ones to be accommodated, because they actually conformed to an aesthetic which was very close to a modern architectural aesthetic. I remember when I was very young, walking around St Catherine's Dock, way before it had been redeveloped, and it was completely abandoned, and they were just sort of choked. But you go in there and you think, what an exciting space. That's the first thing. I was involved in buying a factory in Clerkenwell, and you walk in, and if you're in London, you know, you're used to not having space. That's the first thing that hits you everywhere you live in London. Everybody's sort of wandering around. I mean, you go look at houses, somebody comes in, let me show you around the house. So, you know, and they take you in, they go, oh, excuse me, just get past the kids' bikes. They go, this is the dining room. And then suddenly, you walk into these ex-industrial spaces and go, wow, look at this. Think what I could do with this space. How much and that sort of idea has started the loft business in the States. Because of certain freedoms, which are to do with their political system, that happened much more quickly in the States. It's happening in Detroit now, because Detroit has been abandoned. The forecast is hell on earth. But Detroit, I mean, whole suburbs have been affected by flight. People have gone, but some people are even now arriving in Detroit and going, wow, look at this. Look what we can buy in Detroit for our company. High-tech, internet companies and things like that are going there and saying, this is terrific. We don't care where we are, but we find these abandoned buildings cool. And look how much we can buy for a relatively small amount of money. We're going to work it.
Yeah, exactly. In Sheffield, it is cool, I feel, in Sheffield, to live in Cornish Works, to live in Ward's Brewery. And they've retained as much as possible of those original buildings. It's cool to live in Stirling Works. There isn't much accommodation there, but you're living there with, next to artist studios, next to Butcherworks, which is exhibiting those, which is part of Freeman College, which is training kids with learning difficulties, and the way all of this works together in a real community way, appeals very much to local people. I think, because it's got, back to what you were saying right at the outset, it's got that tradition, and a brand new building hasn't got that.
Well, it's
emotional.
It's difficult for an architect, speaking to our architects here, it is difficult for an architect to make a place. It's quite easy to make a building, but it's difficult to make a place. And we found in the last 50 years that it has been a complicated thing to create new places. Because for some reason, as you said, the energy that comes from the place is to do with its roots in
right back to where you first started with your...
But don't you think that what's quite interesting about those areas, by keeping the best of buildings, and there's no doubt that city's history is going to knock down someone to get rid of things, by keeping the best buildings and their layout, and then saying to master planners or urban planners or even architects, you have to build around there, you actually throw a few things in their way. I mean, a blank space for an architect is actually quite a problem. In a funny way, you're going, okay, blank space, I can put anything I want here. What I'm going to put in here is my imagination, my ego. Now, in a funny way, if you're Mies van der Rohe and you have an ego and an imagination to make a new creation, that's great. If you're another architect, sometimes that can all come horribly unstuck. If you're also a developer who doesn't want to pay much money for architects, because a large amount of the building that's done in Britain has nothing to do with architects, and we need to make sure that this argument isn't between, people and architects. It's not, because architects, where they're used, often do the most magnificent work, but the majority of developers do not use architects. The work that they do is about simply producing cookie-cutter houses off a ground plan and sticking in as many as they can, and that applies to taking buildings. But if there is a sort of series of obstacles, like a problem that has to be solved, that actually does tend to stimulate imagination, and we often see in places, I'm thinking of King's Cross, but you can see it across Britain now, in Clerkenwell and so on. It stimulates people's imaginations, they find solutions, and they work around it. Rather than clearing the whole area and starting again, there's a sense that trying to adapt to what is there, making use of what is there, can actually sort of feed off each other. I think that's a rather wonderful thing with urban planning. I think that's what humankind has always done. That level of improvisation, you can read it everywhere. You can read it in cities which have got part 18th century, part Middle Ages, and part modern. It's a question of what some people call showing respect to what is already there.
Very quick point.
Yeah.
Because one thing that very, very few people in Sheffield, including me, until a few weeks ago, realised is what a tremendous buy-in the university here had into the town. A lot of emotion and a lot of practical work. I mean, you, I think, know about Portal Works, don't you?
Yes.
Which was,
Yeah.
they recently had something called the Festival of Mind. For the first time, you've heard of that, you've come across that now. And I was talking with Christina Cerulli, who was the main driver behind Portal Works. And, you were talking about your work on the Wicker as well. And I think it's absolutely wonderful. This, they have 50 projects that they were talking about in the Festival of Mind. Some, quite, off the wall. But off the wall is cool. Now, there's some completely bonkers things happening in this town. And there's some of the best things. Bonkers in the best sense. Really original, the things you'd never think of.
Well, using bonkers, when I moved into a factory in Clerkenwell, people thought I was bonkers as well. What do you want to go and live there? We're all living in, and the first people who moved into Notting Hill were considered bonkers. What do you want? It's a slum. In a funny sort of way, the imagination that you get, or the freedom that you get, in a way, with being, in a university and meeting other bonkers people, is that you can share bonkers ideas, and it could be saying, if you've ever seen Beaufils Cement Works house, I don't know if they've shown you that. That's extraordinary. He lives in a cement works, and he's taken the cement works. Those huge sort of chimneys and great big sort of silos that you see in a cement works. He's sort of put tiny windows at the top of them and turned them into a crazy crazy, crazy house, and you think, what a brilliant idea. It's just sort of like a place that if you were bonkers enough, you might decide to move in there, and somehow by retaining it, of course it's an eyesore when it first goes up, but with a new use, the world adapts around it. I'm not saying keep all cement works by any means, but what I am saying is one thing that's interesting for everybody here. There's a book called Is Britain Really Great, which I really recommend if you want to go. It's not a challenge, it's just a series of pictures taken by some guys of some of the things that they find hilarious, hilariously bad about Britain. And of course there's crack towns and crack this. And what I think is one of the problems that relates to the coziness of the civic movement is the sense that what we're always trying to do is use our heritage to sort of show market towns, to show old England, to show a safe, convenient place. In a way, all of us, have the judgment to know when something is rubbish. And I wish people would go out. I want an audit made, you see, of towns. Not only an audit of what's good, because it will be useful as a starting point, as a community. We can say, look, we like this is good, although this spoils it. But we could also say, this is really rotten. Who's responsible for this rubbish that we pass every day? This sense, and you say, what is rubbish? How do we know whether it's rubbish? Actually, it's not very difficult to tell. You know, you walk past things and you go, Christ alive, look at this. You know, I feel as a human being that I shouldn't be here for a start. This is a place which has been designed to be a massive roundabout, and I'm not allowed to be here. And who's responsible for it? What good is it doing us except to allow people to travel through our towns at 60 miles an hour, and do we want that? Why? I went to a place called Kurga in Denmark. That's a fantastic experiment. I mean, you talk about the Danes thing, well, that's a bonkers place, because in an 18th century town, they've taken every single road sign off the place. There are no marks on the road, there are no yellow lines telling you can't park, there are no junction marks, there's no sign saying cross here, there are no level, there's nothing. People drive into the town, they slow down to 3 miles an hour. When they get to a junction, they approach it like slower and slower and slower, and then they think there's no coming, maybe I'll just turn, and they go, and it's only a small town, but as a result, nobody goes there in their car, they park outside, they don't need park and ride and all that stuff, and people say, oh, I can't afford the park and ride, we'll park it, don't worry, we'll get to the car park when we go in. They don't need it, because everybody goes, you'd be mad to take your car in there, all that will happen is you'll creep through at 1 mile an hour, and the whole town functions on the idea that they don't have any signs or anything. European-wide, we don't spend enough time looking at European examples. Their management of public spaces, on the whole, is 10 times better than it is in Britain. They seem to have a sense, especially in France, that the dignity of their provincial towns is of prime importance to them. I mean, they don't allow them to be trashed. They care. In Rome, Rome is another bonkers place. I love the way in Rome. I'll just finish the story, and then you're saying I should go. I should go. In Rome, I'm talking about. In Rome, they built a museum to house Hadrian's temple, and it's built at Portland Stage, rather beautiful on the banks of the Tiber, and it's a very beautiful museum. If you're there, I recommend if you're in, go to see the altar in there. It's fantastic. But the people of Rome hate it. It's just about the only really modern building in Rome. They have voted in a mayor in order to tear it down. They're so obsessed with their heritage there that the Romans won't even allow a modern building to bring up to a modern museum to come in. I don't think it should be like that. But you've got to admire the Romans for making their will felt. They are not going to be pushed around by their politicians, and they want the issues of what the place looks like, feels like, what's built there to be on the political agenda. I think one of our problems is we always assume it's somebody else's problem. So what I'm saying to you is, do please join your civic societies, and we'd be really grateful to see more young, eager faces in there. I've got to go and catch a train, but thank you very, very much.